Welcome, weary traveler, to this quiet corner of history. Tonight, as the night sky stretches wide above you and the world drifts into silence, we'll journey far back in time to the land between the rivers. Here, in the Fertile Crescent, humanity first planted seeds, built cities of mud brick and stone, and carved stories into clay. Together, we'll wander through bustling markets of Uruk, stand before the mighty ziggurats of Babylon, and walk the battlefields of kings who dreamed of empire. We'll meet Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, some wise, some ruthless, and see how their ideas shaped the world we live in today. So pull your blanket close, breathe deeply, and let your imagination carry you to Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. Are you ready? Let's begin.
From the end of the Ice Age to the dawn of agriculture. When the great ice sheets of the last Ice Age finally began to retreat around 10,000 BC, the landscape of the Near East was transformed. Rivers cut new channels through fertile valleys. Grassland stretched wide where once there had been tundra, and herds of wild gazelle, aurochs, and boar roamed across the open plains. For untold generations, human beings had followed these herds as nomadic hunters, living in small, mobile bands that moved with the seasons. Yet in the region we now call the Fertile Crescent, a sweeping arc of land stretching from the Levant and Anatolia down into Mesopotamia, something remarkable was beginning to unfold. The rhythms of human existence, which for hundreds of thousands of years had been guided by hunting and gathering, were about to shift toward something altogether different: the deliberate shaping of the environment, the taming of plants and animals, and the birth of agriculture. The first stirrings of this transformation can be seen in the archaeological traces left at sites such as Jericho and Çatalhöyük. These were not yet full-fledged cities, but they were unlike anything humanity had ever built before. Jericho, perched near the banks of the Jordan River, boasted permanent stone structures by around 9000 BC, and over time its inhabitants erected formidable walls and a massive stone tower. What need did they have for such defenses so early in history? The answer is not entirely clear, but it speaks to a growing sense of permanence, of people investing in places rather than simply moving on. Çatalhöyük, in what is now central Turkey, flourished several millennia later, around 7000 BC, as a densely packed settlement of mud brick houses clustered together like a honeycomb, with access gained through roof ladders rather than doors. Here, wall paintings, sculptures, and shrines testify not only to material comfort, but also to an increasingly sophisticated spiritual life. At the heart of this transformation was the domestication of nature. Wild stands of einkorn wheat, barley, and lentils were gradually harvested and sown deliberately, their seeds saved for planting rather than for immediate consumption. In time, these plants were reshaped by human hands, bred into more reliable and productive forms. Alongside them, animals such as goats, sheep, and later cattle were brought into the fold, providing meat, milk, wool, and labor. This was no sudden revolution, it was a slow, experimental process unfolding over generations. But the consequences were profound. With food production came surpluses, and with surpluses came the possibility of larger, more stable communities. These early agricultural villages did not yet resemble the Mesopotamian cities that would one day rise along the Tigris and Euphrates, but they laid the groundwork for them. Permanent dwellings required investment in construction and maintenance. Surplus harvests encouraged storage and eventually systems of distribution. Specialization began to emerge. Some individuals focused more on farming, others on tool making, still others on spiritual roles. And with specialization came hierarchy. Life was no longer entirely egalitarian. roles and responsibilities began to diverge. Religion, too, grew more formalized. Shrines at Çatalhöyük suggest a complex set of beliefs tied to fertility, death, and the cycles of the natural world. These were the first glimmers of the social, economic, and spiritual structures that would define civilization. The Fertile Crescent's unique geography made it particularly suited to this experiment. The rivers and seasonal rains provided water for irrigation, while the varied climate zones offered a diversity of resources. The great twin rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates, were both a blessing and a challenge. Their waters nourished the soil, depositing rich silt during seasonal floods, but they also carried unpredictable danger, overflowing violently and threatening to wash away entire settlements. It was in grappling with these forces of nature that early communities began to develop the technological ingenuity that would characterize Mesopotamian civilization. Irrigation canals, levees, and waterworks became essential, requiring collective organization and cooperation. The seeds of government, in their most primitive form, were sown in the act of channeling river water to fields. By the 5th and 4th millennia BC, these agricultural villages had grown into something entirely new: urban centers. The rise of cities such as Eridu, Uruk, and Ur in southern Mesopotamia marks one of the most significant turning points in human history. Uruk, in particular, stands as a beacon of early urbanism. By around 3500 BC, it may have been home to tens of thousands of people, a staggering concentration of humanity for the time. Within its walls rose monumental architecture, most famously the great ziggurat temples dedicated to the city's patron deity, Inanna. These stepped towers were more than places of worship. They were symbols of collective identity, repositories of wealth, and centers of both political and religious authority. With urban life came new challenges and new solutions. The sheer complexity of managing resources for thousands demanded systems of record-keeping. Clay tokens used for counting gradually evolved into markings on clay tablets, and from there into the earliest form of writing, cuneiform. At first, these marks represented simple tallies of grain, livestock, or labor owed, but over time they blossomed into fully expressive script capable of recording language itself. With writing came the ability to transmit knowledge across generations, to issue decrees, to codify laws, and to craft literature. Humanity had stepped into the realm of history. The early Sumerian city-states were not unified under a single ruler. Instead, each was a political entity into itself, often competing fiercely with its neighbors. They were governed by a combination of priestly authority and emerging kingship, with rulers presenting themselves as chosen by the gods to ensure order and prosperity. Warfare was frequent, driven by disputes over land, water, and prestige. Yet this competition also spurred innovation. Bronze metallurgy appeared, giving rise to stronger tools and weapons. Advances in mathematics and astronomy allowed for more precise calendars and agricultural planning. Social hierarchies became more formalized, with elites, priests, scribes, artisans, farmers, and slaves each occupying defined roles within the urban fabric. Even at this early stage, the legacies of Mesopotamian civilization were taking shape. For example, the idea of codified law has its roots in the need to regulate disputes within these crowded communities. Religion became inseparable from government, as kings built temples not merely as houses for the gods, but as expressions of political legitimacy. And the very notion of empire, the idea that one ruler could extend authority over many cities, was beginning to take form. It would find its first great expression in the conquests of Sargon of Akkad, but the seeds were already planted in the rivalries and ambitions of the Sumerian kings. Thus, by the close of the 4th millennium BC, humanity had crossed a threshold. From scattered bands of hunter-gatherers had emerged farmers, builders, priests, kings, scribes, and warriors. From villages had arisen the first cities, bustling centers of trade, culture, and power. From necessity had sprung invention, and from invention, civilization. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, had become the cradle of all that we recognize as human society today.
The Sumerian city-states and the rise of the Akkadian Empire. By the dawn of the 3rd millennium BC, the land of Sumer in southern Mesopotamia had become a mosaic of bustling city-states, each vying for dominance, each ruled by its own gods, priests, and kings. These early polities, Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Kish, Eridu, and others, were small in scale compared to the great empires that would later rise, but they were immense in their innovation and cultural significance. They gave birth to organized government, monumental architecture, codified religion, and the beginnings of law and justice. Their cities were compact yet monumental, defined by mud brick walls, bustling markets, sprawling temple precincts, and the unmistakable silhouette of the ziggurat reaching skyward, a symbolic ladder between the human and the divine. In these city-states, life was structured by rigid social hierarchies. At the top stood the rulers, kings who were often styled as priest-kings, blending political power with sacred authority. Below them were the priesthoods, who managed temples not only as centers of worship, but also as vast economic institutions that owned land, stored grain, and employed countless laborers. Scribes, trained in the art of cuneiform, occupied a privileged position as the keepers of knowledge, while artisans and merchants thrived in the growing trade networks that linked Mesopotamia to Anatolia, the Levant, and even the Indus Valley. At the base of society were the farmers, who toiled in the fields under the scorching sun, and slaves, often war captives or debt-bonded laborers, who performed the most grueling tasks. The relationship between the cities was rarely peaceful. Land was limited, and the life-giving waters of the Tigris and Euphrates were unpredictable and contested. Records from Lagash and Umma detail repeated conflicts over fertile tracts of farmland, culminating in long wars fought with bronze weapons, chariots drawn by onagers, and disciplined ranks of infantry. Yet war also drove innovation. Cities experimented with fortifications, strategies of siege, and increasingly complex political alliances. To record victories, rulers commissioned grand inscriptions, often blending fact with divine justification. Kings claimed their triumphs were not merely military feats, but signs of divine favor, bestowed by gods such as Enlil, Inanna, or Enki. It was within this world of fractious city-states that one of history's most transformative figures emerged, Sargon of Akkad. His origins are shrouded in legend, a testament to the awe in which later generations held him. According to one tale, Sargon was the child of a humble cupbearer and a priestess, set adrift as an infant in a basket upon the river, only to be rescued and raised by a gardener. This mythic narrative echoes in later traditions, resonating in the story of Moses and others, and serves to cast Sargon as both chosen and extraordinary. What is certain is that he began his career as a servant in the court of the Sumerian king of Kish, gradually rising through the ranks by skill, ambition, and sheer determination. Around 2334 BC, he seized power, and with his army, he set out to achieve what no ruler before him had dared: the unification of Mesopotamia under a single crown. His campaigns were relentless. First, he conquered Kish, and then moved against Uruk, Lagash, and Umma, subduing the once independent Sumerian cities. His military innovations were crucial to his success. The Akkadian army was among the first to be organized as a professional standing force, loyal not to local city gods or councils, but directly to the king himself. Equipped with composite bows, bronze weapons, and supported by efficient logistics systems, Sargon's soldiers swept aside rivals who relied on older, less coordinated systems of levy troops. But his ambitions extended beyond Sumer. His armies marched northward into Assyria, westward to the Mediterranean coast, and eastward toward Elam. In doing so, he created the world's first true empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Levant, and perhaps even touching Anatolia. This was no mere collection of conquered territories. Sargon pioneered techniques of imperial administration that would echo through history. He installed loyal governors, often Akkadian officials, to oversee provinces. He standardized systems of weights and measures, and he promoted Akkadian as the lingua franca of administration, gradually supplanting Sumerian in official documents. The empire's cohesion depended not only on force, but also on ideology. Sargon styled himself not just as a king among kings, but as a ruler favored by the gods. His inscriptions speak of victories granted by Ishtar, the goddess of war and love, and portray him as a shepherd, chosen to lead diverse peoples. This image of the king as a divinely sanctioned ruler became a cornerstone of Mesopotamian political thought and would shape the concept of kingship for millennia. The empire was also a crucible of cultural exchange. The Akkadian language, written in cuneiform script, became a vehicle for literature, law, and administration, blending with Sumerian traditions to create a rich cultural synthesis. Trade flourished under the protection of imperial authority. Timber from the Levant, silver from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and gold from distant lands all flowed into Akkadian cities, enriching their temples and palaces. Yet empire brought challenges as well. Governing a realm so vast and diverse required constant vigilance. Rebellions erupted in conquered cities, often led by former rulers resentful of Akkadian overlordship. External threats pressed in from nomadic tribes who resented the empire's borders. Even within the empire, the strain of maintaining armies, bureaucracy, and monumental building projects weighed heavily on resources. After Sargon's death, his successors, most notably his grandson, Naram-Sin, sought to preserve and expand his legacy. Naram-Sin pushed the ideology of kingship further still, declaring himself king of the 4 quarters of the world, and even taking the unprecedented step of deifying himself during his own lifetime. For the first time in recorded history, a Mesopotamian ruler proclaimed himself a living god, an audacious claim that both solidified his authority and scandalized traditionalists. His reign saw the Akkadian Empire reach its greatest territorial extent, and his military victories were commemorated in grand stele, including the famous Victory Stele of Naram-Sin, which portrays him ascending a mountain in triumph, radiating divine power. But the glory of Akkad could not last forever. By the end of the 3rd millennium BC, the empire was beset by internal strife and external enemies. Rebellions multiplied, provinces broke away, and climate shifts may have worsened agricultural yields, leading to famine. To the north and east, the Gutians, mountain tribes from the Zagros, descended into Mesopotamia, exploiting the empire's weakness. Akkad, once the symbol of unity and power, fractured into chaos. The great experiment of empire had shown both its potential and its fragility. Yet even in decline, the Akkadian achievement left a lasting imprint. The very idea of empire, of centralized administration, standardized systems, and a king whose authority transcended city walls would never again disappear from Mesopotamian history. The fusion of Sumerian and Akkadian cultures produced literature, myths, and legal traditions that continued to resonate. When later kings sought to justify their power, they often invoked Sargon and Naram-Sin as precedents. The memory of the First Empire lived on, shaping the ambitions of those who followed. And indeed, in the aftermath of Akkad's fall, Sumer would experience a remarkable revival, a Neo-Sumerian renaissance that sought to restore order and renew culture after the chaos of imperial collapse. From the ruins of empire, new visions of governance and society would emerge, laying the foundations for yet another cycle in the endlessly dynamic history of Mesopotamia.
The Neo-Sumerian Renaissance and the path to Babylon. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire at the close of the 3rd millennium BC left Mesopotamia in a state of disarray. Where once Sargon and Naram-Sin had imposed a centralized rule stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Levant, now disorder reigned. The Gudians, a tribal people from the Zagros Mountains, poured into the fertile plains of Sumer and Akkad. They lacked the bureaucratic sophistication of the Akkadians and governed instead as loosely organized chieftains, more interested in plundering resources than in administering them. To the scribes of Sumer, this period was remembered as an age of chaos, when the proper order of things was overturned, fields went untilled, and temples fell into neglect. The Gudians became a byword for barbarism in Mesopotamian memory, a foil against which later dynasties defined their own legitimacy. Yet from this darkness came renewal. Around 2100 BC, a new power arose in the city of spearheading what historians call the Neo-Sumerian Renaissance. The dynasty of particularly under the rule of Ur-Nammu and his successors, sought not only to restore the traditions of Sumer, but also to systematize and strengthen them. The kings of III, as this period is often labeled, became master administrators, combining Sumerian cultural pride with innovations that pointed toward the future of Mesopotamian governance. Ur-Nammu, founder of the dynasty, is remembered above all for his law code, one of the earliest surviving examples of codified justice in human history. Though fragments of earlier legal traditions existed, the Code of Ur-Nammu was groundbreaking in its systematic approach. Unlike later, harsher systems, Ur-Nammu's laws often substituted fines or compensation for violent retribution, emphasizing a sense of proportional justice rather than pure vengeance. This marked a profound shift. Law was no longer the arbitrary command of rulers, but a consistent framework meant to apply to society at large. The very idea that justice could be written down, preserved, and referred to as a standard was a step toward civilization's enduring institutions. Beyond law, the UR3 kings excelled in administration. They created a highly organized bureaucracy that kept meticulous records of land, labor, and taxation. Clay tablets from this period reveal a world of astonishing detail. Lists of workers assigned to fields, tallies of livestock, allocations of grain, and inventories of temple offerings. Such documents demonstrate not only the scope of the state's control, but also the importance of writing as a tool of governance. In this sense, the Neo-Sumerian state was as much a creation of scribes as of kings, for without their cuneiform tablets, the system could not have functioned. Architecture also flourished. The kings of III commissioned grand building projects, particularly the construction of monumental ziggurats that loomed over their cities. The most famous was the Great Ziggurat of begun by Ur-Nammu and completed by his son Shogi. Rising in massive stepped terraces, it symbolized not only religious devotion, but also the sheer capacity of the state to mobilize labor and resources. These temples were centers of worship, yes, but also hubs of economy and administration. The ziggurat stood as a physical embodiment of the king's role as intermediary between the gods and his people. Shogi, Ur-Nammu's son, took the dynasty to even higher heights. He reigned for nearly half a century and proclaimed himself both a warrior king and a scholar, boasting of his prowess in battle as well as his mastery of Scrabble arts. Under Shogi, the empire of Ur expanded its reach, bringing large swaths of Mesopotamia and beyond under its sway. He strengthened the bureaucracy, standardized systems of measurement, and sought to instill a sense of cultural unity across his realm. In many ways, Shogi embodied the ideal of Mesopotamian kingship, a figure who combined martial success, administrative skill, and religious devotion. Yet the Neo-Sumerian achievement, for all its brilliance, was fragile. The empire of Ur was heavily centralized, and its demands on labor and resources were immense. Maintaining control over distant provinces required constant oversight, and the burden of taxation weighed heavily on the population. By the end of the 21st century BC, pressures from both within and without mounted. To the east, the Elamites pressed in, eager to exploit Mesopotamia's wealth. To the west, Amorite tribes, Semitic-speaking nomads from the deserts, began to infiltrate and settle within Mesopotamia, gradually undermining the state's cohesion. By around 2004 BC, the city of Ur itself fell to Elamite invaders, marking the end of the Ur III dynasty. The proud ziggurats and temples remained, but the centralized empire collapsed, giving way to a patchwork of successor states. The age of Sumer as a dominant political force was drawing to a close. The Sumerian language would persist in religious and literary context, much as Latin would endure in Europe long after the fall of Rome. But the living, spoken language of daily life shifted increasingly toward Akkadian. A cultural transition was underway, one that would set the stage for Babylon's rise. In the centuries that followed, Mesopotamia became a contested land, divided among Amorite chieftains and local dynasties. Slowly, one city began to emerge from obscurity: Babylon. Originally a modest settlement, Babylon grew in importance under the Amorite rulers who settled in the region. Its strategic position on the Euphrates, combined with shrewd leadership, allowed it to become a center of trade and administration. By the early 18th century BC, under the rule of Hammurabi, Babylon transformed from a regional power into the dominant force in Mesopotamia. Hammurabi's reign, circa 1792 to 1750 BC, is remembered as a golden age, not only for his military conquests, but above all for his codification of law. The Code of Hammurabi is one of the most famous documents from the ancient world, inscribed on a massive stele, topped with an image of the king receiving authority from Shamash, the sun god of justice. The code set out nearly 300 laws, covering everything from property disputes and trade regulations to family matters and punishments for crime. Its principles reflected the stratified nature of Mesopotamian society. Penalties varied depending on whether the offender was a noble, a commoner, or a slave. Yet despite this inequality, the code represented a monumental step in the evolution of legal thought. It proclaimed that law was not arbitrary but grounded in divine order and publicly displayed for all to see. Hammurabi's Babylon became not only a political capital, but also a cultural center. Literature flourished, drawing on Sumerian traditions while expressing them in Akkadian. The Epic of Gilgamesh, already centuries old in oral tradition, was preserved and elaborated upon in this period, ensuring its survival as one of humanity's earliest and most profound works of literature. Babylonian scholars advanced astronomy, mathematics, and medicine, building on centuries of Mesopotamian knowledge and transmitting it to future generations.
The rise of Babylon under Hammurabi thus represents both continuity and transformation. The inheritance of Sumer and Akkad lived on in writing, law, religion, and governance, but it was reshaped into a new form under Amorite leadership. Mesopotamian civilization had entered yet another phase, resilient and adaptive, ever reinventing itself in the face of change. From Babylon's decline to the rise of Assyria. The death of Hammurabi around 1750 BC marked the end of Babylon's first great age. His successors inherited a sprawling realm, but the very forces that had enabled his success now became sources of strain. Governing Mesopotamia's diverse cities, tribes, and provinces required both military strength and administrative finesse. Without Hammurabi's personal authority and charisma, the Babylonian state began to unravel. The empire fragmented as outlying regions asserted independence, and Babylon itself was left vulnerable to outside attack. By the 16th century BC, the once mighty city fell to a shocking blow, a raid by the Hittites from Anatolia. The Hittites, an Indo-European people who had established their own powerful kingdom in central Anatolia, descended upon Mesopotamia in a swift campaign. They plundered Babylon, looting its temples and treasures, then withdrew just as quickly back to their homeland. Though the Hittites did not stay, the sack of Babylon shattered the Amorite dynasty's power. The city that had once unified Mesopotamia under Hammurabi's laws was reduced to a shadow of its former self. Into this vacuum stepped a dynasty that would surprise many, the Kassites. The Kassites were a people of uncertain origin, likely from the Zagros Mountains. Unlike the Hittites, they did not storm Babylon for plunder and leave. Instead, they settled in and gradually assumed control. By the mid-16th century BC, they had established themselves as rulers of Babylonia, inaugurating a dynasty that would last for over 4 centuries, the longest continuous dynasty in Mesopotamian history. The Kassite kings did not achieve this longevity through overwhelming military might, but through pragmatism, adaptability, and diplomacy. They adopted Babylonian culture wholeheartedly, legitimizing themselves as heirs to Hammurabi's legacy. They rebuilt temples, maintained traditional religious practices, and preserved the prestige of Babylon as a sacred and cultural center. To the Kassites, Babylon was more than a political capital. It was a symbol of divine kingship and continuity. By aligning themselves with Babylon's traditions, they secured the loyalty of their subjects and stabilized the region. Culturally, the Kassite period was one of consolidation rather than innovation. The Kassites did not produce monumental legal codes or vast empires, but they provided stability that allowed Mesopotamian traditions to endure. They introduced the kuduru, or boundary stone, inscribed with records of land grants and blessings from the gods. These stones served both legal and religious purposes, symbolizing the intersection of governance, property, and divine authority. Kassite rulers also encouraged long-distance diplomacy, participating in the Great Amarna system of international correspondence in the Late Bronze Age. Letters found in Egypt revealed Babylonian kings exchanging gifts and marriages with the pharaohs, Hittites, and other great powers, treating Babylon as one kingdom among equals in a global network of royal families. Yet while the Kassites preserved Babylon, another power was stirring in the north. The city of Assur, perched on the Tigris River, had long been a trading hub. Its merchants had established colonies as far afield as Anatolia, dealing in tin, textiles, and silver. But by the 14th century BC, Assur began to transform from a mercantile city into a militaristic state. The kings of Assyria harnessed the wealth of trade to build armies, and as Babylon settled into Kassite stability, Assyria began to test its strength.
Early Assyrian rulers, such as Ashurbanipal I, expanded the kingdom's reach, challenging both Babylon and Mitanni, a Hurrian kingdom to the northwest. Through careful diplomacy and ruthless warfare, Assyria emerged as a formidable force by the 13th century BC. The Assyrian kings projected themselves not merely as rulers of a city, but as conquerors destined to dominate. Their armies were organized, disciplined, and innovative, relying increasingly on iron weapons, which were stronger and more durable than the bronze arms of their neighbors. The Assyrians mastered the art of terror as a weapon of policy. Unlike the Kassites, who ruled through diplomacy and cultural assimilation, the Assyrians imposed their authority with brutal clarity. Rebellions were crushed with massacres, deportations, and public displays of violence. Inscriptions from Assyrian kings boast of flaying rebels, piling up corpses, and scattering entire populations across the empire. These tactics were not mindless cruelty. They were deliberate strategies of psychological warfare, designed to instill fear and discourage resistance. Yet, alongside their ferocity, the Assyrians developed sophisticated systems of administration. Conquered territories were integrated into the empire through provincial governors loyal to the king. Roads and communication networks were established to allow rapid movement of troops and messages. Tribute and taxes flowed to the Assyrian heartland, enriching the royal treasuries and funding grand building projects. By the 9th and 8th centuries BC, Assyria had become the dominant power in the Near East. Kings such as Ashurbanipal II and Shalmaneser III expanded the empire's borders, pushing into the Levant, Anatolia, and even pressing against Egypt. Their capital cities, Kalhu, Nineveh, and Dur-Sharrukin, were adorned with colossal palaces decorated with intricate reliefs. These carvings depicted scenes of hunting, warfare, and divine favor, projecting the image of kings as both ruthless warriors and chosen servants of the gods. The contrast with Babylon under the Kassites could not have been greater. While Babylon remained a cultural and religious beacon, its political power waned. Assyria, by contrast, pursued relentless expansion, forging an empire that would become the most feared of its age. The balance of power in Mesopotamia had shifted. No longer was Babylon the unrivaled center of political life. It was now Assyria that cast its long shadow across the region. And yet, Babylon was not forgotten. Even the Assyrians, for all their militarism, recognized its sacred prestige. To control Mesopotamia, one had to control Babylon, not merely as a city, but as a symbol of legitimacy. This enduring reverence for Babylon ensured that, despite its political weakness, it would always remain central to Mesopotamian identity. In the centuries to come, the tension between Assyrian might and Babylonian tradition would shape the destiny of the entire Near East.
The height and fall of the Assyrian Empire. By the 9th century BC, the Assyrian state had fully shed its origins as a modest trading city on the Tigris and become a juggernaut of military power. The transformation was not gradual hesitation, but an almost unstoppable march toward imperial domination. Where other kingdoms relied on seasonal levies and hastily gathered militias, Assyria developed what may have been the first true professional army in history. Soldiers were paid by the crown, equipped by the state, and drilled to fight year-round. This meant Assyria could project power with consistency, striking its neighbors before they had time to muster their defenses. The Assyrian military was a machine of terrifying efficiency. Infantry armed with iron swords and spears formed the core, supported by cavalry, siege engines, and chariots. Iron technology, more resilient than bronze, gave Assyrian soldiers a lethal advantage in battle. They pioneered advanced siege warfare, constructing ramps, towers, and battering rams to bring down city walls. Assyrian kings boasted of breaching seemingly impregnable fortresses and leaving conquered cities smoldering in ruin. But war was never just about the clash of armies. The Assyrians understood the value of terror as a political tool. Inscriptions carved into palace walls described with chilling pride the punishments meted out to rebels. Captives impaled on stakes, flayed alive, or paraded in chains. Whole populations were uprooted and resettled in distant lands, breaking the will of resistance and ensuring no province could easily revolt again. And yet, for all their brutality, the Assyrians were far more than simple warriors. Their empire rested on an administrative foundation that was as impressive as their armies. Provinces were governed by officials loyal to the crown. Tribute was meticulously recorded, and communication flowed swiftly across the realm thanks to a network of roads and relay stations. The Assyrian kings saw themselves not only as conquerors, but as guardians of order, charged by the gods, especially Ashur, their national deity, with ruling the world. This divine mandate justified their expansion, framing conquest not as aggression, but as the restoration of cosmic balance. Cultural achievements flourished in tandem with conquest. The Assyrian capitals, particularly Nineveh, Kalhu, Nimrud, and Dur-Sharrukin, were adorned with monumental palaces whose walls were lined with alabaster reliefs. These reliefs are among the most vivid records of ancient life, depicting in exquisite detail scenes of lion hunts, banquets, battles, and rituals. They project an image of kings who were both fearsome warriors and patrons of civilization. The Assyrian royal libraries, most famously that of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, collected thousands of clay tablets, preserving myths, hymns, medical treatises, astronomical observations, and the great epics of Mesopotamian literature. Without these libraries, much of Sumerian and Babylonian tradition might have been lost forever. The zenith of Assyrian power came in the 8th and 7th century BC under kings such as Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal. Each pushed the empire to new heights. Tiglath-Pileser III reorganized the military and administration, creating a model of centralized control that made the empire more efficient than ever before. Sargon II founded a new capital at Dur-Sharrukin, filled with colossal winged bulls, Lamassu, guarding its gates. Sennacherib, his son, launched devastating campaigns against Judah and famously laid siege to Jerusalem, an event remembered in the Hebrew Bible. Though Jerusalem survived, Assyrian dominance of the Levant was unquestionable. Later, Sennacherib turned on Babylon, razing the city in fury after repeated revolts. To many, this act of sacrilege revealed both the power and the arrogance of Assyrian kingship. Esarhaddon, succeeding Sennacherib, rebuilt Babylon in an act of reconciliation and extended Assyrian power even further, conquering Egypt and boasting of being king from the Persian Gulf to the Nile. His son, Ashurbanipal, presided over what might be called Assyria's cultural golden age. A literate king who prided himself on his learning, Ashurbanipal assembled the great library of Nineveh, commissioning scribes to copy texts from across the empire. In his reign, Assyria seemed invincible, bestriding the Near East like a colossus. But empires built on constant war and ruthless coercion breed enemies as swiftly as they accumulate riches. By the late 7th century BC, Assyria was stretched to its limits. Its conquests required endless campaigns, draining manpower and resources. Subject peoples, long cowed into submission, simmered with resentment. Babylon, despite Assyrian attempts at reconciliation, remained a center of resistance. To the east, the Medes, an Iranian people rising in the Zagros, grew stronger. To the south, Chaldeans in Babylon plotted revolt. To the west, old enemies longed for vengeance. The collapse, when it came, was swift and devastating. In 612 BC, a coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and Scythians laid siege to Nineveh. The great capital, with its massive walls and palaces, fell after a brutal assault. Flames consumed the city, and its treasures were scattered. The Assyrian royal family was slaughtered or fled, and the once mighty empire disintegrated almost overnight. And yet, like Akkad before it, Assyria's legacy endured. Its military organization, administrative practices, and cultural achievements influenced the empires that followed. The brutality for which it was feared did not erase its contributions to art, literature, and governance. Assyria's story became a cautionary tale of hubris and power, remembered both with dread and with awe. From the ashes of Nineveh, a new power rose to claim Mesopotamia's throne, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Under kings such as Nabopolassar and his son Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon would experience a final flowering of glory, reclaiming its ancient prestige and leaving monuments that would echo through legend.
The glory of the Neo-Babylonian Empire and the Persian conquest. The destruction of Nineveh in 612 BC was more than the end of Assyria. It was the rebirth of Babylon. For centuries, Babylon had lingered in the shadow of its northern rival. Its political power diminished, even as its cultural prestige endured. Now, with Assyria gone, Babylon seized the moment. Nabopolassar, a Chaldean chieftain who had risen to power in southern Mesopotamia, declared himself king of Babylon and leader of the coalition that had toppled the Assyrian behemoth. His reign inaugurated the Neo-Babylonian Empire, a brief but dazzling chapter in Mesopotamian history. Nabopolassar consolidated his authority by reasserting Babylon's traditional role as the religious and cultural heart of Mesopotamia. His reign was defined by both war and restoration. Militarily, he continued to press against Assyrian remnants, ensuring that no rival could reclaim the old empire's mantle. Politically, he restored temples, patronized the priesthood, and reaffirmed Babylon's status as the chosen city of Marduk, chief of the gods. In this way, he fused conquest with legitimacy, presenting himself not merely as a usurper, but as the rightful restorer of divine order. It was his son, Nebuchadnezzar II, ruled 605 to 562 BC, who transformed Babylon into one of the wonders of the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar inherited his father's throne at a moment of opportunity. With Assyria destroyed, the map of the Near East was open for reordering. Egypt, long a rival power, sought to fill the vacuum, extending its influence into Syria and the Levant. Nebuchadnezzar met this challenge decisively. In 605 BC, at the Battle of Carchemish, Babylonian forces clashed with the Egyptians and their allies. The victory was resounding. Egypt retreated back to its homeland, never again to dominate the Fertile Crescent, and Babylon emerged as the uncontested heir to Assyria's empire. Nebuchadnezzar embarked on a series of campaigns to secure Babylon's dominance. He subdued the Levantine states, including Tyre and Judah. The conquest of Jerusalem in 597 BC, and again in 587 after a rebellion, left an indelible mark on history. The city was razed, its temple destroyed, and much of its population deported to Babylon. This event, remembered as the Babylonian captivity, reshaped Jewish identity and theology. In exile, Jewish scribes and prophets reflected deeply on covenant, law, and divine justice, producing texts that would become central to the Hebrew Bible. Thus, Nebuchadnezzar's conquests reverberated not only in politics but in religion, shaping traditions that endure to this day. At home, Nebuchadnezzar poured his energies into transforming Babylon into a metropolis worthy of its reputation as the Gate of the Gods. He rebuilt the city's walls, making them among the most formidable in the ancient world. Massive double walls, reinforced with towers and wide enough for chariots to pass, encircled the capital. The Ishtar Gate, one of the most magnificent monuments of antiquity, was constructed under his reign. Adorned with glazed blue bricks and reliefs of dragons and bulls, it stood as both a ceremonial entrance and a symbol of divine protection. Perhaps most famous of all were the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Though their precise existence remains debated, ancient writers describe them as lush terraces of greenery, built to please Nebuchadnezzar's queen, who longed for the mountains of her homeland. Ingenious irrigation systems are said to have lifted water from the Euphrates to nourish the gardens, creating a paradise of trees and flowers in the heart of the city. Whether myth or reality, the legend of the gardens captures the grandeur and ambition of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. The city itself was a marvel. The great processional way, paved with stone and lined with lions, led through the Ishtar Gate to the vast temple complex of Esagila, dedicated to Marduk. Towering above the city rose the Etemenanki, a massive ziggurat traditionally identified with the biblical Tower of Babel. For Babylonians, it symbolized the link between heaven and earth. For later visitors, it was a source of awe and speculation. Within its palaces and temples, Nebuchadnezzar's artisans, scribes, and priests created a cultural efflorescence that rivaled anything in Mesopotamian history. Yet the Neo-Babylonian Empire, for all its magnificence, was short-lived. Nebuchadnezzar's successors lacked his vigor. Internal strife, court intrigue, and priestly disputes weakened the state. The last Neo-Babylonian king, Nabonidus, alienated the powerful Marduk priesthood by elevating the moon god Sin as his favorite deity. His long absence from Babylon while campaigning in Arabia further eroded loyalty at home. Discontent simmered, and the empire's cohesion frayed.
Meanwhile, beyond Mesopotamia's eastern frontier, a new power was rising: the Persians. Under the leadership of Cyrus the Great, the Persian Empire rapidly expanded from its base in the Iranian plateau, conquering Media, Lydia, and vast territories across Asia. In 539 BC, Cyrus turned his gaze toward Babylon. His army advanced swiftly, and according to both Babylonian records and later Greek accounts, the city fell with astonishing ease. The Persians diverted the Euphrates, entering the city under its walls. Nabonidus was captured, and Babylon surrendered without a prolonged siege. Cyrus presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. In the famous Cyrus Cylinder, he declared that he had restored the worship of Babylon's gods, returned displaced peoples to their homelands, and ruled with justice. To the Jewish exiles, Cyrus's policies were a blessing. He allowed them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, earning him a revered place in biblical tradition. Unlike the Assyrians, who ruled by fear, or the Babylonians, who had exiled populations, the Persians governed through tolerance and incorporation. They respected local traditions while establishing a vast imperial system that ensured stability across diverse lands. With Babylon's conquest, Mesopotamia entered a new era. Independent dynasties had come to an end. From now on, Mesopotamia would be part of larger imperial frameworks: the Persian Achaemenid Empire, followed by the Greeks, Parthians, and Romans. Yet even under foreign rule, Babylon remained a city of immense cultural prestige. Its temples, ziggurats, and scholarly traditions continued to flourish, supported by kings who recognized the value of Babylonian heritage. Thus, the fall of Babylon to Persia did not mark the end of Mesopotamian civilization, but rather its transformation. The Persians preserved much of its culture, ensuring that the legacy of Sumer, Akkad, Assyria, and Babylon would endure, woven into the fabric of a far larger world.
From Persia to Islam and the enduring legacy of Mesopotamia. The conquest of Babylon by Cyrus the Great in 539 BC marked not only the end of Babylonian independence, but also the beginning of a new imperial order. Under the Achaemenid Persians, Mesopotamia was integrated into a vast, multicultural empire that stretched from the Indus Valley to Egypt. Unlike the Assyrians with their terror, or the Babylonians with their forced deportations, the Persians ruled with a policy of tolerance and respect for local traditions. Aramaic was established as the imperial lingua franca, enabling communication across immense distances. Governors, or satraps, administered provinces with a degree of autonomy, while local temples continued their rituals largely undisturbed. Babylon itself remained a thriving city, hosting royal proclamations and serving as a center of learning. The Persians preserved much of Mesopotamian culture while embedding it within a new imperial framework. The astronomers of Babylon, who had long charted the heavens, continued their observations, refining systems of mathematics and timekeeping that would influence Greek science. The scribes of the temples maintained their traditions of cuneiform, though by this time Aramaic scripts were increasingly dominant. Religion remained central. Marduk's temple, Esagila, was still the heart of Babylonian devotion, even as Zoroastrianism, the faith of the Persian kings, gained prominence across the empire. When Alexander the Great swept into Mesopotamia in the 330s BC, he encountered a land of deep traditions and towering monuments. After defeating the Persians, Alexander entered Babylon as a liberator. Unlike so many conquerors, he marveled at the city's grandeur and chose it as a seat of his empire. For a time, Babylon seemed destined to regain its place as the heart of the known world. Alexander planned grand building projects, including the restoration of the great ziggurat, Etemenanki. Yet fate intervened. In 323 BC, Alexander died suddenly in Babylon, his empire collapsing into chaos. For centuries afterward, his death in the city became symbolic, as if the grandeur of Mesopotamia had claimed even the greatest conqueror of them all. In the wake of Alexander's death, Mesopotamia passed under the rule of the Seleucid dynasty, founded by one of his generals. Under the Seleucids, Babylon declined as new Hellenistic cities, such as Seleucia on the Tigris, became centers of administration and trade. Greek culture mingled with Mesopotamian traditions, producing a fusion of ideas in art, philosophy, and science. Yet Babylon's ancient temples gradually fell into disrepair. Cuneiform, once the script of kings and priests, slowly faded from daily use. By the 1st century AD, the ability to read it was lost, its secrets buried in clay tablets awaiting rediscovery millennia later. As centuries passed, Mesopotamia came under new rulers. The Parthians, an Iranian dynasty, established their empire across the Near East. They allowed Mesopotamian cities considerable autonomy, and Babylon, though diminished, remained a religious center. Later, the Sasanian Empire, 224 to 651 AD, rose reviving Persian traditions and ruling with vigor from their capital at Ctesiphon on the Tigris. Under the Sasanians, Mesopotamia was once again a core region of a great empire, rich in agriculture, trade, and scholarship. Zoroastrian fire temples stood alongside Babylonian shrines, Jewish communities, and increasingly Christian congregations. For Mesopotamia, the Sasanian centuries were a time of pluralism and intellectual exchange, though always overshadowed by wars with Rome and later Byzantium. The decisive transformation came in the 7th century AD with the Arab-Islamic conquest. In a matter of decades, Muslim armies swept across the Near East, toppling the Sasanian Empire and incorporating Mesopotamia into the rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate. The old capitals of Assyria and Babylon were then ruins,
But a new city, Baghdad, would soon rise under the Abbasid dynasty to become the jewel of the Islamic world. Founded in the 8th century, Baghdad inherited the intellectual legacy of Mesopotamia, becoming a hub of scholarship, translation, and innovation. Greek, Persian, and Indian texts were translated into Arabic, while the mathematical, astronomical, and medical traditions of Mesopotamia lived on through Islamic science.
Thus, the ancient civilization of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria did not vanish. It transformed. Cuneiform tablets lay forgotten, but their spirit survived in the algebra, astronomy, and medicine developed in Baghdad's House of Wisdom. The ziggurats crumbled, but their memory echoed in later religious architecture and myth. The Mesopotamian gods no longer commanded worship, but the intellectual frameworks they inspired, law, justice, cosmic order, shaped Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. By the medieval period, Mesopotamia was no longer seen as a cradle of civilization, but as part of the Islamic heartland. The ruins of Uruk, and Nineveh lay buried under centuries of silt and neglect. Yet their legacy persisted invisibly, woven into the very fabric of global culture. Time, law codes, city life, imperial governance, astronomy, mathematics, literature, all bore the imprint of Mesopotamia's long experiment in civilization. It was not until the 19th century that Western scholars, digging into the mounds of Iraq, rediscovered this forgotten world. The decipherment of cuneiform unlocked the voices of kings, scribes, and poets who had lain silent for thousands of years. The Epic of Gilgamesh, long buried in Ashurbanipal's library, spoke again of humanity's struggle with mortality. Hammurabi's code revealed the ancient roots of law. Ziggurats and temples rose again in scholarly imagination, reminding modern society that the ideas and institutions we take for granted were first forged in the land between the rivers. Today, Mesopotamia is remembered as the cradle of civilization, the place where humanity first domesticated crops, built cities, invented writing, codified law, and dreamed of empire. Its story is one of resilience and transformation, of rise and fall, of brilliance and brutality. Though the cities have crumbled and the languages fallen silent, the legacy of Mesopotamia endures wherever humans govern by law, measure the heavens, build great cities, or tell stories about the meaning of life and death. The rivers still flow, as they did in the days of Uruk and Babylon. Their waters bear silent witness to the civilizations that rose and fell upon their banks. And though time has moved on, the achievements of Mesopotamia remain with us, foundational stones upon which all later human history has been built.
The rediscovery of Mesopotamia in the modern age. For centuries after the Arab-Islamic conquest, the ruins of Mesopotamia lay forgotten, buried beneath layers of dust and time. The towering ziggurats crumbled into shapeless mounds, and the palaces of Assyrian kings were swallowed by the earth. To the travelers of the Middle Ages, these mounds were little more than strange hills dotting the plains of Iraq. The names of Sumer, Akkad, and Nineveh faded into silence, surviving only faintly in biblical memory and scattered references in classical texts. Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, had become a ghost. It was not until the age of European exploration and imperial expansion in the 18th and 19th centuries that the lost world of Mesopotamia began to stir again. Western travelers, diplomats, and adventurers, often stationed in the Ottoman Empire, looked upon the great mounds of Mesopotamia with curiosity. Local legends whispered that these hills hid ancient kings and treasures. To the European imagination, inspired by the Bible and by classical authors, the lure was irresistible. What lay beneath the earth of Mesopotamia? Could the fabled cities of the Old Testament, Nineveh, Babylon, still be found? The first real breakthroughs came in the early 19th century. Claudius James Rich, a British resident in Baghdad, began mapping and describing the ruins of Babylon. His careful notes awakened scholarly interest back in Europe. Soon after, the French consul, Paul-Émile Botta, began digging at Khorsabad in the 1840s, uncovering the palace of Sargon II, complete with colossal winged bowls, or lamassu, that stunned the European public. Suddenly, Assyria was no longer a name from scripture, but a civilization whose art and architecture could be touched and seen. The true pioneer of Mesopotamian rediscovery, however, was Austen Henry Layard, a young English adventurer with little formal training but boundless curiosity. In the 1840s, Layard began excavations at Nimrud and Nineveh. What he unearthed astonished the world. Vast palaces decorated with intricate stone reliefs, libraries of cuneiform tablets, and the majestic lamassu statues standing guard at gateways. For Victorian Britain, these discoveries were a sensation. Newspapers and exhibitions in London presented the treasures of Assyria as proof of both biblical history and imperial grandeur. Assyrian kings, once half-mythical figures, suddenly reappeared in stone and text. Layard was joined by Hormozdrasam, an Assyrian Christian from Mosul, who continued the excavations and discovered the legendary epic of Gilgamesh among the cuneiform tablets of Ashurbanipal's library. The rediscovery of this epic, older than Homer, filled with themes of mortality, friendship, and the search for meaning, reshaped the understanding of world literature. It showed that Mesopotamia was not merely a backdrop for biblical events, but a cradle of human imagination and storytelling.
Meanwhile, European scholars worked feverishly to unlock the script that covered the clay tablets. Cuneiform was unlike any writing they had seen. Wedge-shaped impressions pressed into clay, often in hundreds of lines. For decades, it was a puzzle. Gradually, through comparison with old Persian inscriptions at Behistun, scholars like Henry Rawlinson cracked the code. By the mid-19th century, cuneiform was deciphered, and the voices of Mesopotamia began to speak again after 2,000 years of silence. Kings boasted of conquests, scribes recorded laws and contracts, priests copied hymns to gods long forgotten. A lost world had come alive. The rediscovery of Mesopotamia transformed Western thought. For Europeans and Americans alike, it confirmed the antiquity of the Bible, while also challenging long-held assumptions. The Epic of Gilgamesh, with its flood narrative, echoed stories of Noah. The Code of Hammurabi showed that systems of law predated Mosaic tradition. Mesopotamian astronomy, mathematics, and medicine revealed the deep intellectual foundations of civilization itself. Museums in London, Paris, Berlin, and later New York displayed colossal lamassu and tablets, feeding a fascination with the cradle of civilization. But this rediscovery also had another side. Excavations often stripped Mesopotamian sites of their treasures, carrying them off to European capitals. Local communities were rarely included, and the land of Iraq saw its heritage carted away in crates. The great lamassu that once guarded Assyrian palaces now towered in the halls of the British Museum and the Louvre, symbols of both cultural achievement and colonial appropriation. Yet for all its complexities, the modern rediscovery of Mesopotamia ensured that the world would never again forget it. Scholars in Europe and America pieced together the history of Sumer, Akkad, Assyria, and Babylon, creating the field of Assyriology. Archaeology revealed not just temples and palaces, but the daily lives of farmers, merchants, and scribes. The voices of Mesopotamia were restored to the human story, reminding modern audiences that civilization had many roots. Today, Mesopotamian studies continue to inspire. Archaeologists still uncover new tablets, while digital tools now allow scholars worldwide to study cuneiform in unprecedented detail. The rediscovery that began with Laird, Rassam, and Rawlinson has become a global effort, linking the past to the present. For Americans and Europeans, Mesopotamia is no longer a distant biblical land, but a living reminder of the foundations of law, literature, science, and city life. And so the story comes full circle. From the dawn of agriculture after the Ice Age, through the rise of cities and empires, to the Persian conquest and Islamic transformation, Mesopotamia shaped human history. Then, after centuries of silence, it was rediscovered in modern times, its treasures lighting up museum halls and academic libraries. The land between the rivers has taught us not only how civilizations rise and fall, but also how memory itself can be lost and found again.
Mesopotamia's influence on the modern world. The rediscovery of Mesopotamia in the 19th century was not simply an archaeological triumph, it was a revelation about ourselves. As Europeans and Americans studied the tablets, reliefs, and ruins brought back from the deserts of Iraq, they began to realize that many of the structures of modern life had been born in the land between the rivers. Mesopotamia was not just ancient, it was enduring. Its spirit continues to shape our politics, our sciences, our laws, and even our dreams. One of the clearest legacies is law. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed nearly 4,000 years ago, laid out principles of justice that still resonate today. That law should be written, that it should apply consistently, and that rulers themselves are bound to administer it fairly. Though its punishments were harsh and its society stratified, Hammurabi's vision of public law planted the seed for all subsequent legal systems. In Europe and America, the idea that justice must be codified and not left to the whims of rulers finds its earliest ancestor in Babylon. Every constitution, every Bill of Rights, every court that appeals to written law carries an echo of Mesopotamia. Equally profound is Mesopotamia's role in the measurement of time and mathematics. The Babylonians worked with a base 60 system, which explains why we divide hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. Every clock in the United States ticking away seconds, every European mapmaker charting longitude and latitude, is unknowingly continuing a Mesopotamian tradition. Babylonian astronomers also tracked the motions of planets with extraordinary precision, laying groundwork that influenced Greek astronomy and, through it, the scientific revolutions of Europe. The study of the skies, today pursued in NASA observatories or the European Space Agency, has roots in those first Mesopotamian scholars gazing up at the night sky over the plains of Uruk and Babylon.
Religion, too, bears Mesopotamian fingerprints. The flood story, found in Gilgamesh and earlier Sumerian myths, parallels the story of Noah in the Bible. The concept of divine justice, cosmic order, and the struggle between good and evil shaped Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions that still dominate Europe and America today. Even the very notion of a sacred city, chosen by the gods, finds precedent in Mesopotamian devotion to Uruk, and Babylon. When pilgrims walk in Rome, Canterbury, or Jerusalem, they continue the pattern established millennia earlier in Mesopotamian temples. The urban world that we take for granted, crowded cities, bureaucracy, zoning, trade, taxation, all began in Mesopotamia. The American skyscraper, the European Parliament, the global financial districts all trace their lineage back to Uruk, the world's first true city. The bureaucratic systems that structure modern governments, tax records, censuses, and archives mirror the cuneiform tablets kept by Sumerian and Babylonian scribes. Even in the digital age, with cloud storage replacing clay, the basic idea remains the same. A civilization cannot exist without records. Mesopotamia also shaped the concept of empire. From Sargon of Akkad's centralized state to the Assyrian model of provincial governors, later empires borrowed ideas of governance, logistics, and propaganda. The Roman Empire, the British Empire, and even the modern superpowers of today all operate within patterns first pioneered in Mesopotamia. The image of a ruler as shepherd, guardian, and divine representative is as alive in presidential inaugurations and royal coronations as it was in Sargon's inscriptions. For Europeans and Americans in the 19th and 20th centuries, the rediscovery of Mesopotamia was more than curiosity, it was identity. To walk through the British Museum or the Louvre, gazing at Assyrian reliefs and Babylonian stelae, was to encounter the deep roots of Western civilization. To read Gilgamesh in translation was to feel a kinship with voices 4 millennia old. And in America, where biblical history was often the framework of cultural understanding, Mesopotamia provided context and depth. It showed that the stories of Genesis had ancient neighbors, that civilization itself had been older and richer than once imagined. Today, the legacy of Mesopotamia is everywhere. In the legal codes that govern America and Europe, in the timepieces ticking on wrists, in the literature that asks timeless questions, in the very structure of cities, even in the language of law and politics, justice, order, empire, covenant, there is an echo of clay tablets pressed thousands of years ago. Mesopotamia is not gone. It lives in us. It lives in every street city, every court of law, every scientific observatory, every bedtime story told to children across America and Europe. The rivers may have shifted, the ziggurats may have crumbled, but the foundations remain. The cradle of civilization still rocks us, gently as we dream.